Okay, I mean, it's interesting talking to you about these alternatives, because the one thing you haven't mentioned is, surely in the long term we're going to have to become an electric-run world, and yet you haven't mentioned, plug-in hybrids or building more train networks or any of this stuff. Yeah. What are the barriers to actually converting the world over to electricity?
When we talk about oil and the demand side, it became mainly an issue of transportation now. For example, in the 1970s, when we had the oil price shock, we were using oil for producing electricity. We were using oil for heating homes, but it changed. In terms of producing electricity, we are using now coal, gas, renewables, nuclear power. At home, we are using, again, electricity for heating or natural gas. But now, the oil demand is concentrating more and more on the transportation sector. In the last 5 years, about 98% of the growth in the OECD countries, in the rich countries, came only from transportation sector. But the difficulty is transportation sector. It is very difficult to find alternatives to oil. So, and I believe this is the Achilles heel of our society, that the oil demand is focusing only on transportation sector, where you have almost no viable, easy alternatives. So what we have to do is that we have to review our transportation system rather than the fuel we are using there, because it is very difficult to find alternatives to oil, but we can find alternatives to our existing transportation system. I see there at least 3 areas that we can look into very closely. The first one is the road pricing. We can put a significant amount of price and taxes of using roads, and therefore discourage the people to use less and less private cars. The second one is the plug-in vehicles, the electric vehicles, but this can be only a viable option if the electrical vehicles cost come down, and if we get the electricity from a non-oil, non-gas alternative. And we have here 2 major options: either coal, which is a problem for the environment, or nuclear power, which is good, no environmental problems, produces electricity at a low cost, but there's a public acceptance issue in the nuclear power. And the third option is that, again, we need to move our transportation system, which is based on the private transportation now, to a more mass transportation, such as cars, metros in the cities, and so on.
It's interesting because in the US you see how car dependent they are. In Europe we're okay, and in China and India they have barely got started, so they all are on mass. But to convert the US into a mass transport, surely in the long term, countries like the newer countries like Australia, the US, Canada, New Zealand, these countries are going to be the ones that are the worst affected in the long term by this.
I think the US economy is very vulnerable in terms of the energy economy, is very vulnerable to the high oil prices. If there's a price shock, if there's an escalation of the prices, because the transportation system, which is mainly based on the private vehicle ownership. Therefore, I think it is for the US politicians very important to consider to at least slow down the vehicle ownership levels, the growth there, and to look at other options, to develop other options. For China and India, they are unfortunately imitating what happened in the Western countries, and they are putting more and more emphasis on the private vehicle ownership, which is not a good news for the future.
Okay. Why do you think that this topic has literally been forgotten over since the 79, 80? It was big news. I've been watching archive footage of the 70s and Hubbard on TV and all these things, and then it just disappeared. Even BP and Shell, they were projecting that by the year 2000 we would hit peak oil and all this back in the 70s. And yet they've changed their tune. I mean, they're kind of changing back a bit slowly, but what happened?
I think the energy economy has unfortunately has a very short memory. What we have seen in the 70s and even before that, people reminded us that the resources what we have are not endless. We have to make our plans accordingly. However, the very efficient operation of the international oil companies in the markets and making use of the available, easy, cheap oil in the Gulf of Mexico and in North Sea made us to be a bit too relaxed. And we have not received an electroshock, namely the high oil prices, to come to ourselves and to really think, where are we going, what are we heading ahead, what are we going there. So therefore, I believe the lack of signal of the prices and the governments not taking this issue seriously, they were the reasons of our being too relaxed. And now, where we are now, we have to be very cautious. We don't need to panic. There is no need for panic, but we have to be very cautious and make the necessary steps as soon as possible in order to reduce the oil demand growth and increase the production. Otherwise, as I said, we can have very troubled days, even higher prices than we are experiencing now.
I was going to ask one more question.
It's 20 past 11.
Okay.
Okay.
Can we just quickly...
Sorry, I'll change the tape.